The Duke hadn't slept in 9 nights. Not once, not even for an hour. The physicians came and went with tonics that sat untouched. His brother paced the corridors, white-faced with worry. The servants whispered prayers in corners. And through it all, Duke Alistair Voss remained awake, his face gray with exhaustion, eyes fixed on nothing as though sleep itself had become an enemy he refused to surrender to. But when the quiet maid from the lowest floor finally sat beside his chair on the 10th morning, something impossible happened. His eyes closed, and for the first time since the accident, he slept. 3 weeks earlier, the Voss estate had been preparing for autumn with its usual precision. The falconry grounds were cleared for the season's final hunt. The stables were restocked. Every corridor gleamed. And Duke Alistair Voss moved through it all with his characteristic control, silent, composed, untouchable. Then came the riding accident that should have killed him. A spooked horse. A thrown rider. A fall that sent him crashing into the stone wall bordering the eastern pasture with enough force that the crack echoed across the grounds. Servants found him unconscious in the grass, blood streaking his temple, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. They carried him inside, summoned physicians, set the broken bones, cleaned the wounds, and waited. He woke 6 hours later, eyes sharp and furious, refusing opiates, refusing rest, refusing everything except the assurance that he could stand. They told him he needed weeks of recovery. He was back at his desk within 2 days. But something had changed. The Duke stopped sleeping. At first, no one noticed. He had always been an early riser, often working before dawn. But then servants began encountering him in the library at midnight, still dressed, still working. Then at 3 in the morning. Then at 5, unchanged from the night before. His valet mentioned it cautiously. The Duke dismissed him. His brother confronted him directly. The Duke walked away mid-sentence. By the 5th night, even the most oblivious members of the household understood something was wrong. The Duke's face had taken on a hollow, haunted quality. His movements remained precise, but slower, as though each step required conscious thought. His temper, usually cold and controlled, began fraying at unexpected moments. On the 7th night, his brother summoned 3 physicians. They examined him thoroughly, testing for head injuries, residual trauma, neurological damage. They found nothing conclusive. One suggested sleeping draughts. The Duke refused. Another recommended enforced bed rest. The Duke ordered him from the room. "I don't need rest," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I need you to leave." But his hands shook as he said it. By the 9th night, desperation set in. The Duke could barely stand without swaying. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, his entire frame radiating exhaustion so severe it seemed impossible he remained conscious. Yet every time someone suggested sleep, his reaction was immediate and visceral. Anger, refusal, something close to panic. His brother finally understood. The Duke wasn't refusing sleep. He was afraid of it. Maeve had worked in the lowest kitchens of Voss Manor for 8 months without drawing notice. She preferred it that way. Invisible meant safe. Quiet meant steady work. And steady work meant survival. She woke before dawn, prepared breakfast for the upper servants, scrubbed floors that would be walked over within minutes, and returned to her narrow room each night without complaint. The other servants considered her odd, too educated for her position, too composed, too careful with her words. But she worked hard, caused no trouble, and asked for nothing. So when the head housekeeper appeared in the kitchen on the 10th morning and said the Duke's brother had requested her presence upstairs, Maeve's first instinct was fear. "Why?" she asked carefully. The housekeeper looked exhausted. "Because nothing else has worked." The explanation made no sense. But Maeve followed anyway, her heart beating unevenly as they climbed stairs she had never been permitted to use before. They passed through corridors lined with portraits, beneath chandeliers worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, past windows overlooking grounds so vast they seemed to stretch into eternity. Finally, they stopped outside the Duke's private study. "He won't listen to physicians," the housekeeper said quietly. "He won't listen to family. He's dying, Miss Karen, and he won't tell us why." Maeve stared at her. "And you think he'll listen to me?" "No." The housekeeper's voice was blunt. "But 3 nights ago, you stayed late cleaning the upper gallery. The Duke passed you in the corridor, and for 5 minutes afterward, his hands stopped shaking. It's the only time in 9 days anyone has seen him calm." Maeve's chest tightened. She remembered that night. The silent encounter. The way the Duke had paused just briefly, his gaze distant and unfocused. She had not thought he even noticed her. "I don't understand what you expect me to do," she said. "Neither do I," the housekeeper admitted. "But he's in there now, barely upright. And if someone doesn't help him soon, his heart will simply stop." The words settled like stones. Maeve swallowed once, then pushed open the door. The study was dim despite the morning light. Heavy curtains blocked most of the sun, and the fire had burned down to embers. The Duke sat in a chair near the window, his posture rigid despite obvious exhaustion, hands gripping the armrests as though holding himself upright by will alone. He didn't look up when she entered. Maeve stopped a few steps inside the room, unsure whether to speak or wait. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint crackle of dying coals. Finally, she did what instinct told her. She moved quietly to the chair opposite him and sat. Still, he didn't react. Minutes passed. The Duke's breathing was shallow, controlled, deliberate. His eyes remained open, fixed on something beyond the window that she couldn't see. And though every part of him radiated exhaustion, there was something else beneath it, something raw and unyielding that looked almost like terror. "You don't have to explain," Maeve said softly. His gaze shifted to her then, sharp despite the haze of sleeplessness. "I didn't ask for company." "I know." Another long pause. His jaw tightened, but he didn't order her out. Maeve folded her hands in her lap, keeping her voice low and steady. "My brother couldn't sleep after a fire took our neighbor's house. He was inside when it started, got out safely, but afterward, every time he closed his eyes, he was back there." The Duke's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness shifted. "He stayed awake for 6 days," she continued. "Thought if he just pushed through, the fear would stop on its own. Instead, he collapsed during market. Woke up 3 hours later, screaming. Why are you telling me this?" His voice was hoarse. "Because you're not refusing sleep," Maeve said quietly. "You're afraid of it." The words landed cleanly. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. Then, slowly, his hands loosened their grip on the armrests. "I see it," he said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "Every time I close my eyes. The fall, the impact, the moment I thought." He stopped, his jaw working. "I dream I didn't wake up, that I'm still there, trapped, unable to move or speak while the world continues without me." Maeve's chest tightened. "So you stay awake?" "Yes." "And you believe that's sustainable?" His laugh was bitter. "No, but the alternative is worse." She understood then. Not the specifics, not the visceral terror of his particular nightmare, but the shape of it. The way trauma could turn rest into a battleground. "What helped your brother?" the Duke asked after a moment, and the question surprised her. "Time," she said honestly, "and someone sitting with him while he slept. So when the nightmares came, he wasn't alone." The Duke looked at her fully now. Exhaustion and something else. Hope, maybe, or desperation, flickering behind his eyes. "You're suggesting I require a nursemaid?" "I'm suggesting you need to sleep before your body makes the choice for you," Maeve replied. "And that perhaps it would be easier if someone stayed." "Who?" "I will." The offer hung between them. Too simple, too strange. A kitchen maid volunteering to sit vigil beside a Duke. It should have been absurd. Yet neither of them moved. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Maeve considered lying, offering something noble or selfless. Instead, she told the truth. "Because I know what it's like to be afraid, and I know what it's like when no one notices." Something in his expression cracked, just slightly. He looked away, toward the dying fire, and for the first time since she'd entered, his shoulders lowered. "If I sleep," he said slowly, "and the nightmare comes, then I'll wake you," Maeve interrupted gently. "And you'll know you survived it." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again with visible effort. "You understand this is irregular?" "Yes. People will talk. They already are." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone almost instantly. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't name. Then, finally, he nodded once. "Stay," he said. Maeve settled, deeper into her chair, folding her hands calmly in her lap despite the strangeness of the moment. The Duke leaned back slowly, his entire body resisting even as exhaustion dragged at him. His eyes closed, opened, closed again, and this time they stayed closed. His breathing deepened gradually, the rigid control in his posture softening as sleep finally, mercifully, claimed him. Maeve watched quietly, her own heart beating unevenly, aware that something significant had just occurred. Something that went beyond duty or charity. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The Duke slept, and Maeve kept watch. And when the nightmare came, when his breathing quickened and his hands clenched, she did exactly what she'd promised. She leaned forward and said his name. Once. Quietly. He woke with a sharp inhale, disoriented, eyes wild for a moment before finding her. And in that moment, the terror receded. "You're here," he said, as though confirming reality. "I'm here," Maeve replied. He exhaled slowly, then closed his eyes again, and slept. For 3 days, the pattern held. The Duke slept only when Maeve sat near him, sometimes in his study, sometimes in the chair beside his bed after his valet reluctantly allowed it. She read quietly while he rested, woke him when the nightmares came, and spoke in low, steady tones until the terror faded and sleep reclaimed him. The household noticed, of course. Servants whispered. His brother watched with cautious relief. The physicians muttered about unorthodox methods, but couldn't argue with results. And slowly, the Duke began to recover. By the 4th day, he slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. By the 5th, the color returned to his face. By the 6th, he woke without panic, his gaze finding her first, grounding himself in her presence before anything else. But as his body healed, something more complicated emerged. On the 7th night, after waking from a mercifully brief nightmare, the Duke didn't close his eyes again. Instead, he looked at her in the lamplight, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "You should return to your work," he said quietly. "I've taken enough of your time." Maeve set down the book she'd been reading. "Are you asking me to leave? Or telling yourself you should?" The distinction landed precisely. He smiled faintly. "I don't know. Then I'll stay until you do." He studied her for a long moment. "Why did you really agree to this?" She could have deflected. Instead, she met his gaze. "Because when you looked at me in that corridor 3 weeks ago, you saw me. Not my position, not my usefulness. Me. No one here has done that before." The Duke's expression shifted. Surprise, recognition, something deeper. "I remember," he said quietly. "You were carrying linens. Too many of them. I almost offered to help before I realized how absurd that would seem." Maeve's breath caught. "You thought about helping me?" "I think about you more than I should," he admitted, and the honesty of it hung between them, raw and undeniable. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Maeve did something she'd never done before. She reached across the space between their chairs and rested her hand gently over his. "The nightmares will fade," she said softly. "They always do, given time. But you don't have to face them alone." The Duke's fingers curled around hers, holding on as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted dangerously. "And when they're gone," he asked, "will you still stay?" It was the question beneath every other question. Not about nightmares or recovery, but about what came after. About whether whatever had formed between them in these strange, quiet nights could survive daylight and scrutiny and the impossible distance their worlds demanded. Maeve squeezed his hand once. "Do you want me to?" "Yes." No hesitation. No pretense. Just truth. She smiled then, soft and certain. "Then I will." 3 months later, the household staff gathered in the main hall for an announcement no one had anticipated. Duke Alistair Voss stood before them, composed as always, but with a warmth in his expression that hadn't existed before the accident. Beside him stood Maeve Karen, no longer dressed in kitchen grays, but in the deep blue of the Voss family colors. "Some of you will find this unconventional," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "And you would be right. But I have learned that the most important things often are." He glanced at Maeve, and something in that look made several of the younger maids sigh audibly. "Miss Karen will be joining this household in a new capacity," he continued, "as my wife." The ripple of shock moved through the room instantly, but before it could settle into gossip, the Duke's brother stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "The family supports this union," he said firmly, "as should all of you." It wasn't a request. Slowly, the staff began to applaud, some genuinely pleased, others simply pragmatic enough to recognize which way the wind was blowing. Maeve accepted it with quiet grace, her hands steady in the Duke's. Later, when the hall had emptied and they stood alone in the corridor where they'd first truly seen each other, The Duke turned to her with a question in his eyes. No regrets, he asked softly. Maeve smiled. Only that I didn't sit beside you sooner. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. I sleep better now, he murmured. Every night. I know, she replied. I'm there. And she was. Not as a cure or a solution, but as a partner. Someone who had seen him at his most vulnerable and chosen to stay anyway. Someone whose presence transformed fear into safety, isolation into home. The nightmares still came occasionally, as trauma echoes always do. But when they did, the Duke no longer faced him alone. He would wake to find Maeve beside him, her hand in his, her voice steady and sure. And he would close his eyes again and sleep.